I'd like to introduce Christina Lee, our presenter today. And she first gave this presentation, or one similar to the Boulder Atheists, a month or so ago. It was really great. And so we invited her to do this presentation for humanism at the Hub. So we got a really good attendance here, and that's really great. Christina M. Lee has been an open atheist for about 6 years. She is a PhD student in communication studies at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, where she studies the intersections of religion, politics, and rhetoric, with a particular interest in the marginalization of atheists in the United States. I'm proud to introduce Christina Lee. So take it away.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here on this Saturday afternoon. I'm going to share my screen, so if someone give me a thumbs up. Can you see my screen? Cool. Yes. Awesome. So as mentioned, or if you read the meetup page, I'm going to be talking about this concept called Theist-normativity and Theist-normative Legislation, which is a concept I've been working on since my master's at CSU. And it's one of those power structures that's very similar to heteronormativity, patriarchy, white privilege, those types of issues, but it's kind of looking at how religion plays a role in the normative structures in our society. So many of you may have been familiar with the secular survey that came out earlier this year. There's a lot of great information in that survey about the experience of non-religious, atheist, secular individuals in the United States. And one thing that comes up that's not really surprising is that many non-religious individuals feel the need to conceal their non-religious identity. And so there were a lot of statements in the survey talking about people saying, you know, I go by the don't ask, don't tell policy. I only tell close friends of an atheist. Just filling out this survey makes me nervous because I'm afraid someone's going to find out. And this is partially what drives a lot of my interest, is trying to understand why in a country that's supposed to have freedom of religion, people who are not religious feel this need to conceal their identity, to feel this need to pass as religious quite often. And I would say there's two kind of major components to this. The first is something that we can see in this survey that came out in 2014, and this is actually this original survey that really got me into what I study currently. And this is from the Public Religion Research Institute, and they asked people who counts as truly American, always a dangerous question, but two of the most popular answers I want to bring to your attention. Number two was believing in God. 69% of people who responded to this survey said that it's at least somewhat important to believe in God to be truly American, while over 50% said it was very important. And furthermore, over 50% said it's specifically important to be Christian to be truly American. So we already kind of have this idea that to be a true American, you need to believe in a higher power. On the flip side, there's this idea that if you are an atheist, you are un-American. These are some real billboards that were put up after some atheists challenged the national anthem, or the national motto and the Pledge of Allegiance, you know, saying atheists hate America and anti-God is anti-American. And this isn't really surprising. This is a long narrative that we have throughout US history that atheism is the opposite of Americanism and became particularly popular in the Cold War. But it's not really surprising that in a society where people tend to believe that to be true Americans, you need to be theistic. And if you're not, you're anti-American or you hate America or you're un-American, people might want to hide their identities. And this is really at the core of this concept of theist normativity, which I define as the understanding of theism, the belief in God or gods as dominant and natural. Theist normativity is coercively reinforced through narratives about what is natural and normal. So we're kind of just continually told, like, common sense, it's normal to believe in a higher power, and if you don't, it's deviant. Which gets to the idea that these narratives really tend to favor bodies that fall into the norm while punishing bodies that appear perverse. And this isn't just about identity, a lot of it is about behavior. So for example, if there's someone who may claim to be a Christian, but then say they don't bow their head in prayer or something, their loyalty, their Americanism will be pulled into question. An atheist, on the other hand, being an atheist isn't necessarily a problem. Saying you're an atheist or refusing to participate in prayer or things like that, that's what seems to be problematic, because people are upset when you do that. And just funny side note, when I was making this PowerPoint, this little devil was the symbol that PowerPoint suggested I use for the slide. So, you know, even questioning religion and bringing that to your attention kind of automatically makes us assume Satanism and devil and bad. So fun kind of side fact. So theist normativity is something that a lot of us experience in our day-to-day lives. This is kind of expectation that we're going to be religious, us having to choose whether or not to tell people we're not, those types of issues. But what I tend to focus on more is, what is it about our political rhetoric that reinforces this theist normative narrative? And two of the most prominent examples are our national motto, "In God We Trust," and our Pledge of Allegiance with the one nation under God. This is probably not surprising. These are very prominent narratives that we see kind of all the time. But I want to bring these out particularly because I'm sure most of you kind of already aware that these are kind of very kind of religious privileging comments. But one of the reasons why I think it's particularly important to talk about it within the secular community is this is also from the Secular Survey, where people were asked to list the 3 most important policies that they wanted secular groups to really try to focus on. And you can see here that opposing religious displays on public property was the lowest importance. And this doesn't mean that people don't think this is important. It just means it didn't make their top 3 most important, which is completely understandable. As previously discussed, social justice issues are a major thing for our community. And so it's not surprising that a lot of these issues ranked higher. But one of the things I hope to convince you in this presentation is that by opposing religious displays on property, we're actually really helping some of these other issues, because particularly Christian nationalist groups often try to use this type of theist normative legislation and religious displays, such as "In God We Trust" bills, to try to justify discrimination in these certain areas. And so it's something that as a group, we can be really active in trying to oppose, so we can kind of stop this normatization of theist normativity. So I want to talk about theist-normative legislation, which is basically official legislation that contributes to a national narrative that codifies people as theistic. So it's basically policies, laws from kind of federal, state government that tells people that they should see themselves as believers in a higher power. And the time we kind of got the most huge chunk of these kind of into our system is the Cold War, from 1952 to 1956 specifically. Between 1952 and 1956, we had the National Day of Prayer became an annual event. So now the president is required once a year to declare a National Day of Prayer. There was a prayer room added to Congress. Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. "In God We Trust" was required to be put on all money, and "In God We Trust" became our national motto. So this was right at the height of the Cold War. There was this common narrative of our enemy are the atheistic communists, and this legislation was often used to kind of say this is a spiritual weapon and it's our way of fighting against this enemy, and we need to reinforce our belief in God because that's going to make us stronger. So that was kind of how a lot of this was justified. So those of you who were at my presentation for the Boulder Atheists, I talked a lot about the history of under God and the way Congress justified that, which was very kind of saying things like an atheist American is a contradiction of terms, so it doesn't matter that the atheist can't say the pledge, those types of things. But for this presentation, I'm going to specifically focus on "In God We Trust." And for that, I'm actually going to have to go back in time, about 90 years before this, to the Civil War, and to talk about the foundation. But that's really important because the foundation from the Civil War was used to really justify almost all of these theist normative examples. The idea of "In God We Trust" being on coins was used to justify all of these other theist normative legislation. So they really tie in together. And once you get one established, it's much easier to get the next one established. So in 1861, a reverend by the name of M.R. Watkins wrote to the Secretary of the Treasurer, Chase, arguing that there needs to be a motto on coins that reflects our belief in the Almighty God. And he suggested the motto, "God, Liberty, and Law." Now, in this letter, Reverend Watkinson was saying things like, we are in the middle of the Civil War, and if we fall, future societies may think that we are a heathen nation, and we don't want to do that. So we need to leave proof that we believe in a higher power. And he really tried to appeal to Chase's Christianity to make these points. Now, Chase was very supportive of this idea, and 1 week later, he wrote a letter to James Pollock, the director of the Mint of Philadelphia, instructing him to immediately design a new coin to include the motto, to acknowledge God. And Chase definitely relied on a lot of theist-normative logics in his appeal to Pollock, in which he argued things such as a democracy cannot exist unless the people recognize God, unless they believe in God, which is a very kind of basic theist-normative narrative that our society will fail if we don't believe in a higher power, and we have a moral obligation to do this. We want our society to exist. And he kind of was saying, our motto should reflect that our people trust America, trust in God. Now, it's important to note that Pollock was a very active member of the National Reform Association, also known as the NRA. And this is an organization that still exists that has, throughout history, tried to implement what's known as the Christian Amendment into the Constitution, which is basically an amendment that says we acknowledge Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, as the bestowers of our gifts. And so it would literally make the United States a Christian nation. And they've always failed, but they've tried over and over again, and Pollock was a very big supporter of this. So he was all for this new change. So in 1963, it was finally agreed upon that "In God We Trust" would become the motto to put on coins. And in his annual report, Pollock argued, "We claim to be a Christian nation. Why should we not vindicate our character by honoring the gods of nation in the exercise of our political sovereignty as a nation? Our national coinage should do this. Its legends and devices should declare our trust in God and Him who is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords." Now, one of the reasons why this is particularly important to bring up is that in common arguments defending the use of "In God We Trust," the common idea is that it's an example of civil religion or ceremonial deism. It's not explicitly Christian, it's not meant to be Christian, and it's something that anyone can appreciate, and no matter what your religion is. If we look at these kind of founding archival documents that justify why this was added, it's very clear that Christianity was at the core of the purpose. And I'll keep coming back to this a lot, but that's just kind of a really big important, because it really kind of questions the way we think about history and how we're told history is when it comes to these mottos. So in 1864, Congress approved the revision, and "In God We Trust" appeared on the 2-cent coin. So that was kind of the basic foundation of this. These three men were particularly kind of the key players in getting this motto onto our coins for the first time, almost 100 years after our nation was founded. So it's also really important to note that in 1908, the motto was reinforced on coins. So Theodore Roosevelt actually designed a new coin, and he took the motto off. And he was met with some very serious backlash from this that made him very frustrated. But he ultimately said that if Congress wants to reinstate the motto, he won't fight back. And Congress was very quick to respond and to reinforce the motto. And in doing so, they had a lot of different arguments, but I want to highlight two that come up in the congressional hearing on this issue. And the first is, again, the idea of wanting to spread Christianity. So, for example, there was one representative who claimed that we have a lot of missionaries around the world spreading the word of Jesus, and they can use this coin to give to people who've never heard of Jesus, and they'll know that the greatest nation on earth believes in Jesus Christ. Or this quote here, which I think is really kind of summarizes many of the arguments you see in this congressional hearing, which is from Representative Charles Carlin, who said, "We are a united people. Civil war and strife are forever banished from our lands. Eternal peace on earth and goodwill towards men is the hope of every patriotic citizen. This is and will be as long as we are firm and steadfast in the teaching of the gods of Israel. And I entertain the hope and belief that before the world sees another century, Christian thought and Christian ideas will control the hearts and minds of all men, and upon the wall of every home throughout the universe, there will hang for the enlightenment and encouragement of all who may follow the sacred motto, In God We Trust." So again, when people say that the God in God We Trust is not the Christian God, very easy to go back to these kind of foundational documents of Congress members who were the ones who made this so integral as part of our political narrative. It was very much about Christianity. This idea that they wanted Christian thoughts and Christian ideas to control all of the hearts of people. And this really shows how theist normativity in the United States is very much connected to Christianity. So they also argued here that this isn't a violation of the First Amendment because it's not one specific Christian denomination. They argued that any Protestant, Catholic, or Jew can appreciate this motto, so it's not a violation of the First Amendment. And so that's one of the really powerful things about theist normative rhetorics, is that they kind of appear to be more widely acceptable. They're not so explicitly to one group, but if you really read behind the narrative, there's definitely a lot of kind of Christian privilege behind them. Now, the other major narrative that comes out of this congressional hearing is the desire to silence infidels. So at the time, infidels was a term that was commonly used to describe atheists. It could also be used to describe anybody who was non-Christian, but it was kind of predominantly used to describe non-theists. So when Roosevelt originally took the motto off of coins, a lot of free thought groups and secular groups were very excited about this. They celebrated it. And this was something that members of Congress weren't very happy about. As Representative Shepherd pointed out, that infidels' objection of the motto on coins ought to prompt the Congress unanimously to restore the words. So this idea that just because infidels like it is enough for us to want to put it back. We don't want infidels to get what they want, that kind of idea. And Representative Edwards was one Congress member who brought up this issue of infidelity a lot. And he concluded his kind of speech on the issue by saying, "Let us therefore fight infidelity until it is literally stamped out of our country. Let us not retrograde, but rather let us go forward. Let us do nothing that smacks of national infidelity. Let us not put an infidel money out upon the world, but let us put out the coin that says to all the world, Americans are a God-fearing and God-loving people." So kind of best case situation, he's saying like, let's stamp out atheism and non-religious religion from our society. Worst case scenario, he's saying, let's stamp out anything non-Christian. It's kind of hard to say for sure since infidel can be used different ways. Either way though, there is the First Amendment that's kind of being ignored here. So it's really important to kind of think about how these mottos not only promoted Christianity, but how they were very aware that these mottos were used to silence religious minorities. That was not something that was not addressed. It was very intentional, for sure. So that leads us to 1950s Theist-normative legislation and back to this timeline. As I mentioned, the use of "In God We Trust" on coins was used to justify pretty much all of these theist-normative policies. And we also see in 1954, the NRA, the National Reform Association, makes another attempt to pass the Christian Amendment. And it's the one that they were probably the most successful in. Obviously, it still didn't pass, but it was one that got further than they usually do, which was concerning, and probably a lot has to do with the Cold War and the Red Scare. And so that didn't pass, but then kind of right afterwards, they did kind of begin to support the "In God We Trust" being required on all money, and "In God We Trust" becoming the national motto. Now, interestingly, I actually don't have a whole lot to say about these implementations during the 1950s because they happened very quickly, and there was very little discussion in Congress about actually doing it. It didn't get a full-blown hearing like a lot of the other legislation did. It was kind of this very quick, just we want to do this, we're going to do it. And it was kind of like the first one on money was just kind of slid into a bill for the Treasury, and God We Trust one, which took a little bit longer, but it still wasn't really a widespread, wide publicized narrative. And we see this, I actually have a letter from one person after it was passed who wrote to their senator complaining about this, and they ask why the Russian secrecy, and they accuse Congress at the time of totalitarian methods, and they're saying they're acting like the terrible dictators that they are always criticizing. And he makes the comment that I, for one, am getting a little tired of this "In God We Trust" childishness. If we really trusted an invisible being, we would not be arming ourselves to the teeth. So there was some resistance to these mottos, but part of the problem was this, and pretty much all this legislation went through quite fast. So even under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, that only took 4 months to do. And if you know anything about Congress, Congress is usually a little bit slower. And in these cases, they were very quick to pass this type of legislation. And there certainly was opposition, a lot of them in letters, and I have a lot of letters from people opposing these things. But it's also important to note that opposing these types of legislations, particularly in the 1950s, was really dangerous. This is the height of the Cold War. President Eisenhower and other politicians in general, did a lot of work to kind of frame the idea that being theistic is what it means to be American, and atheism leads to communism. Atheism is the enemy. That's what I kind of wrote my master's thesis on, so I'm happy to talk more about that issue if you want to hear more about that. But this is the height of the Red Scare. If you're accused of being un-American or being a communist, it can have serious social consequences. So a lot of people who may have opposed these changes, it really wasn't worth the risk to openly criticize them. And that's a really key aspect of theist normativity, of this idea. It really coupled well with the Cold War, unfortunately, because it really reinforced this narrative that if you oppose these things, you're un-American. For example, when Under God was added, President Eisenhower said, anyone who truly loves America will support this change. So if you don't, when the president of the United States says that and you don't support it, you might not want to say anything because people might think you don't truly love America. So you can see how coercive this legislation really was in trying to silence groups and try to promote this theist normative narrative. Now, since this time, there have been many groups who have opposed different types of theist normative legislation, particularly Under God and In God We Trust. But judges tend to reinforce the motto, primarily using the argument that the use of God in politics is something that's always gone on. It's traditional. It's not a specific Christian religion. It's a broad religion. It's not establishing a religion, those types of narratives. And one example I think particularly interesting is that in 2018, there was a case in Minnesota where they specifically challenged In God We Trust. And the judge in that case, stated that certainly no reasonable observer would think that the government is attempting to force citizens to express trust in God with every monetary transaction. So he was claiming, no one would actually think that. Well, interestingly, there's another case, for those of you who are familiar with the Satanic Temple, in which they tried to give an invocation before a Phoenix City Hall meeting. They were originally told they could. There was massive backlash about the idea of Satanists giving this prayer. And there was a big town forum where people from the community could come in and give their reasons for why the Satanic Temple should or should not, mostly should not, give this prayer. And one of the earliest people speaking stated, how many people actually have a dollar bill or a piece of money in their wallet or pocket? I do believe it says, In God We Trust. Every time this dollar bill is exchanged with another person, it's spreading God. Apparently, this man, and a lot of people in the audience, if you watch the video, applaud him, say yes, they affirm his statement. They apparently think that, yeah, this is kind of spreading the word of God with every monetary transaction. And that's actually something that I think is particularly important when we look at issues of religion in the public sphere and this notion of a reasonable observer, because pretty consistently when Christians, for example, look at In God We Trust and view it as the Christian God, it's viewed as acceptable. But when atheists come in and say, we think it's emphasizing Christians and Christianity, they're being unreasonable. So there's kind of this different standard where these atheists opposing it were unreasonable. The Christians in this situation were completely using logic to make their arguments and weren't criticized widely, at least by the dominant narrative. Like, we might think it's not reasonable, but the dominant kind of society isn't going to view it as that. And arguably that largely has to do with theist normativity and what we consider to be normal, reasonable, being kind of tied to those power structures of what is religion. And I just want to go back to this real quick and just pointing out there's a lot of different social issues that people use the In God We Trust as kind of an official statement from the government that can justify their statements for when it comes to these social issues. So this first one, for example, is pro-life people being anti-abortion, using In God We Trust to justify their reading of life and using the Bible to define that. Another one here being same-sex marriage. And that's really common for the issue of same-sex marriage. The most common argument is using the Bible, and that's really kind of at the core theist-normative logics of assuming that other people should accept the Bible as the core of our laws. And that's why, as I said earlier, we really want to kind of be aware of these national mottos in this theist-normative legislation, because it's really used to reinforce other narratives. And I don't have time to talk about it now, but I just want to acknowledge that you can see here that they're talking about the Torah, and the connection of Jewish Americans and theist normativity is very complex, because Jewish Americans are often included in these narratives with the whole Judeo-Christian tradition. But in a lot of ways, theist normativity, while it rhetorically protects Jewish Americans, it also kind of tends to hide the massive amount of anti-Semitism we have in the United States. So it's a very complex relationship, Jewish Americans and this issue of theist normativity. But I just kind of want to wrap this up by talking about some issues of contemporary theist-normative legislation that we need to be aware of and we need to fight against. So I'm sure some of you have heard about the Project Blitz, which is a legislative movement that is headed by the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation, as well as several other known Christian nationalist groups. And according to Project Blitz's playbook, which they renamed themselves to Freedom for All. Project Blitz is a much more accurate name, which was their original name that they named themselves, mind you. So I'm going to keep calling them Project Blitz. So they say that the goal of Project Blitz is to protect the free exercise of traditional Judeo-Christian religious values and beliefs in the public square, and to reclaim and properly define the narrative which supports such beliefs. So Project Blitz firmly believes that we've moved way too secular, and they're trying to reinforce the previous narrative, that theist-normative narrative, I would argue, that really promotes Christian nationalism. And what they do is they basically bombard our system with a bunch of different legislation that will support their cause. The idea being that if they do a bunch of legislation, opposition can't fight at all, and at least some of it will stick. And it comes in 3 different phases that are very important. Phase 1 is focused on relatively easy to pass legislation that appears largely ceremonial or symbolic. One of the key examples being in God We Trust bills, which are basically bills that either have official kind of highly recommendations or mandatory putting of in God We Trust on public buildings, in public schools, on public properties such as police cars, or making a license plate available with in God We Trust on it. And the idea is that these are, because it's the national motto, it won't get a lot of opposition. And even when there is opposition, Project Blitz spokespersons are very good at reframing that and saying, well, they're anti-American, they're anti-faith, they hate religion, we have freedom of religion, stop attacking us. So they're very good at reframing the narrative very quickly when this type of legislation is opposed. Now, phase 2 focuses on promoting and celebrating and normalizing Christianity in the public sphere. So these are legislation policies such as biblical literacy classes in public schools, or declarations of Christian heritage weeks to celebrate the United States' Christian history, those types of narratives. And phase 3, which is particularly concerning, they're all concerning, but these ones in particular, are what they call religious liberty protection legislation, which are basically laws that are based off of biblical understandings of morals. And most prominently, these are laws that relate to same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption, same-sex, or just sexuality and gender, so such as reliance on a maintenance of birth gender laws. So again, this idea that phase 1 or 2 is going to help them get to this more discriminatory, or what they view as religious freedom laws. And they're very explicit about this. As one of the members stated, and this is actually in their playbooks, it's in their official playbook that they have posted, which if you want the link to that, I'm happy to share it. They say, despite arguments that this type of legislation is not needed, measures such as in God We Trust bills can have an enormous impact. Even if it does not become law, it can still provide the basis to shore up later support for other governmental entities to support religious displays. So Christian nationalists and Project Blitz are very well aware of the power of the national motto to help justify their agenda. And they know they can use it without being accused of violating the First Amendment. But then the more we see God in the public sphere, the more Christianity becomes normalized, then the easier it is to justify laws based on biblical reasoning. So it's very strategic, and it's something we should definitely work to fight back against. This is an example of an In God We Trust in Louisiana. I believe this one was. So very prominent display in a public school. And this was how it was justified by, I want to note, a Democratic state senator, who argued that this is our national motto. It's also on our currency. So I think it's really important that we ensure that young people understand the patriotic history of our country and how it was founded and its purpose. I'm willing to bet that this history is not going to include an actual history of how In God We Trust was put on coins, and its exclusionary language, its explicitly Christian language, or its history throughout US's use there. And I think that we want to be really wary of how people kind of frame history and how people try to justify this, and make sure we know the history so that we can bring that up and say, no, that's actually not necessarily the case. Now, this was going to be mostly the end of my presentation, but then Donald Trump tweeted something this morning, so you get to hear about a Donald Trump tweet. That really kind of gets to the core of theist normativity at a large point, and how it's still used to try to discipline non-theists in particular. So Trump tweeted, "The Democrats took the word God out of the Pledge of Allegiance at the Democratic National Convention. At first I thought they made a mistake, but it wasn't. It was done on purpose. Remember, evangelical Christians and all, this is where they are coming from. It's done. Vote November 3rd. So a couple notes. One, this is not fully true. At the DNC, they said the Pledge of Allegiance 4 times every night, and every night they included God. What he's referring to is there were 2 caucuses, the Muslim delegates and allies and the LGBTQ caucus, who had things happen right before the live national convention where they didn't include God. So notably, these are 2 groups that are understandably might oppose God in the Pledge of Allegiance, or who are hurt by theist-normative legislation. So it's not surprising they wouldn't use it. I think it's important to note that while the Republican Party certainly tends to promote Christian nationalism quite extensively, obviously much more than the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party still reinforces theist normativity regularly. President Obama, who was great for the secular community, he also reinforced theist normativity regularly. So it's not just a partisan issue. This is an issue kind of amongst all groups. But also I think it's important to point out that he specifically kind of calls out evangelical Christians to point out this. Again, kind of a hint that the God in the pledge is the Christian God. And he says this is where they are coming from, which this idea this is where they're coming from, this idea of removing God, is this kind of subtle, kind of back into our public memory that it's really bad to oppose God. And if you oppose God, if you're not theistic, then you are a danger to our society. And this framing of the Democrats, or he recently accused Biden of having no religion, was this move that's kind of to reinforce theist normative narratives. That idea of being non-religious is problematic. So what can we do? It's always great to get information, but if we can't do anything with it, then what's the point? Number 1, challenge theist normative legislation. Pay attention to it. I recommend following blitzwatch.org, where they really track what Project Blitz is doing. You can look at every state to see what types of laws are happening. So this year there were 2 Project Blitz laws in Colorado that both failed, luckily. But we want to make sure we know what legislation is happening so we can fight it. The second is that if you have the privilege to be able to be open about your non-theistic identity, if you have one, use it. We tend, I think, in the secular community to kind of use the come out narrative as kind of our main kind of cry, but I think it's important to note that a lot of people can't safely come out because there's so much stigma on that identity, and especially if you have multiple stigmatizations, there's multiple marginalized identities, why would you add another one to yourself willingly? So those of us who have the privilege to be open, we can really try to challenge these ideas of, an atheist or a non-religious person is un-American, is immoral. We can challenge that, and we can call out theist normativity. But you can challenge theist normativity in your everyday life, whether you're theistic or not. So you can call on your friends to do it. You can do it even when you're passing in a lot of different ways. So for example, pretty much my entire family is still Christian, and we still get along really well. Everything's really good, but it's great because I can talk to my family about theist normativity. And my mom, for example, will see someone post something on Facebook like, our founders believed in one nation under God. And she'll be like, actually, that's not true. And so I'm like, thanks, Mom. And it's a great way to build allies, because there are a lot of Christians who believe in the First Amendment and who believe in freedom of religion and who would also want to challenge this type of theist normativity. So it's a really great way to build allies. And finally, I think it's important for us to think about how we can reframe arguments about history to acknowledge the issue of Christian theistic coercion. I think we have a tendency in the secular community to really focus on this argument that the United States was founded on secularism. It was founded on the separation of church and state. And it's definitely true that the Constitution is a secular document, and there were very clear attempts to make us a secular nation. But Christianity was very powerful throughout US history. And it's important to acknowledge that and kind of say it's very similar to issues like white privilege, patriarchy, heteronormativity, to say it's been a part of our history from the beginning. But just because it's tradition doesn't mean we should keep doing it. And I really draw a lot from the work of David Sahet. I highly recommend this book because it really gets into some of the great important histories of religious persecution and the lack of religious freedom throughout US history. And he states that we will never understand the source, the development, or the stakes of the debate about religion in public life until we acknowledge that for much of its history, the United States was controlled by Protestant Christians who sponsored a moral regime that was both coercive and exclusionary. And I very much agree with Sahet here that we need to acknowledge that history and call out that history. And when Christian nationalists try to use that history to justify their agenda, tell them no. Tell them that we don't want these types of normative structures to dictate our laws. We want to evolve to really kind of adhere to our national ideals. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you hear the applause?
I could see the applause.
Yeah, I tried to unmute everybody. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah. Unmute and applause. Didn't work.
Thank you.
So it didn't, I was able to unmute it. Anyway, thank you so much, Christina. That was good. I'm looking for questions.
What?
I sent one in.
For me, first of all, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was really good. You know, it's said in the media that, you know, younger people are leaning to be more liberal. And I wonder, how is it with your friends, your cohort? Do they kind of accept you? Or, you know, is there criticism, or, you know, how is that?
Yeah, I mean, overall, I would say, especially in my immediate community where I do research, there's certainly a diverse group of kind of religious views, but it tends to be really well accepted, particularly amongst the friends that I keep. I have one particular acquaintance who, like, every 3 years, he'll send me a message on Facebook being like, so I see you've grown to hate Christians now. And I'm like, I don't hate Christians. Like, that is not what I'm saying. If you read anything that I post, I oppose Christian privilege, but I'm all for interfaith dialogue. And so, like, I have had some negative where I think some people tend to feel like, again, me just being open about my atheism and me criticizing Christianity as me shoving my atheism down people's throats and things like that, which is frustrating. But I'm pretty lucky in that, at least in my immediate group of friends, it hasn't, you know, and my colleagues, it hasn't been too bad.
Good. Okay. Thank you.
No.
I got a question.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do it this way and let people go ahead and just chime in if you have a question, because I think that'll work out okay.
Christina, what do you know about during the Civil War, when you mentioned that they're trying to place a model, both the North and the South were trying to do it. One to support slavery, one to be against. I find it always interesting for opposing sides to use God for their efforts. That was done in many wars.
Oh yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think, you know, it's interesting. I oftentimes make the argument that almost every social issue that we have faced in the United States has at its core been an argument over how to interpret the Bible. And the abolition movement and slavery was certainly one of the most obvious ones. I mean, I'm actually working on a project now where I'm looking at how Southern preachers would often frame the abolition movement in the North as the atheist movement. So this it was really interesting. Religion was always at the core of it. But yeah, I mean, Civil War is definitely an interesting one to look at when it looks at religion, because it's the first time Lincoln used the phrase under God in his Gettysburg Address, and that's oftentimes used as proof that we're a nation under God because Lincoln said it. So it's interesting kind of how, that can be a single speech from a single president can be used as proof of the nature of our entire nation and our position when it comes to religion.
Thank you.
Christina, this is Andrea. I was really disappointed at the Democratic Convention when he opened with a prayer dedicated to Jesus. And I know he's religious, but the whole theme of the convention was diversity and acceptance, and and then he has a preacher literally invoking the name of Jesus and praying. Also, Congress always opens with prayer, Christian, and it's just not why. And especially Biden, if he's trying to include everybody, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, whomever, atheists. Well, maybe not us, but whatever.
Yeah.
All right.
Sorry, do you want to?
Why?
So I think there's kind of two parts to that. I think one, issues of like Congress always opening with prayer, and I think this is a really great example of how oftentimes with religious normativity, whether it's Christian privilege, theist normativity, however, whatever you want to call it, it's oftentimes framed as okay because it's tradition, because it's always been done, which again is why I think it's really important to argue, okay, yes, it has always been done, but that doesn't make it okay. There's a great quote by a scholar who wrote his last name is Ellis, I can't think of his first name right now, and he wrote a book about the history of the pledge of the flag, and he says, the phrase one nation under God is akin to one nation under white men. Historically accurate perhaps, but exclusionary nonetheless. And that
there are a lot of things that have been done always, bias against women as property, bias against blacks, bias against the Chinese when they built the railroads. Just because something's always been done doesn't mean that it's always right.
Absolutely, which is why I think it's really important for us to start thinking about issues of religious persecution, religious privilege in the kind of the same strand of normativity and oppression that we talk about issues related to like race and gender and sexuality in those narratives. To your other point as to why Biden specifically, did use Jesus. So there's a scholar named Kevin Coe who does a lot of work on what's called the God strategy, which is really this very strategic use of invoking God, particularly in presidential rhetoric. And unfortunately, in the 1980s, through Reagan and Bush Sr., Democrats didn't tend to invoke religion quite as much, and it didn't really work very well. We got Reagan and Bush, and partially, not fully because, but partially because they were able to appeal to evangelicals very well, which is a very strong voting bloc. Whether we agree with them or not, they're very powerful and they're very well organized. And then Clinton came along and he actually invoked religion pretty much more than any Republican did. And it worked really well for him. And so there's almost this idea, even amongst Democrats, is that for non-theists overwhelmingly tend to be Democrat. So our vote is almost kind of guaranteed. So there's not a need to pander to a group that's kind of a guarantee, but from like moderate Christians or for even some maybe moderate evangelicals, their vote can still be won. So it is kind of a strategic move that, I can't fully fault him for, but also it is unfortunate that, it wasn't until 2019 that secular Americans were even acknowledged by the DNC in their platform. And that's a huge step, but, we still have a way to go before we're acknowledged as true Americans.
I get the praying to God thing, sort of, because it does so much good, but invoking Jesus, that was just seriously not okay.
Christina.
Because that was directed just to the Christians, and left everybody else out.
So Christina,
And,
following
you know,
on that-
sneaky, underhanded Trump is doing things to appeal to Jews, and they're a very powerful voting bloc too. And yeah, I don't know. I just thought it was not okay and really out of place.
So Christina, following on,
And all the prayers are, but that's me.
Christina, are you
Go ahead,
seeing,
Joe.
thanks. Are you seeing that
Thank you.
there's more of a
Thanks,
rise
Andrea.
of the non-theists running for office and more importantly, actually winning now?
Hemant Mehta does some work on this, and he's been keeping track of non-theists in this election running, and there are a lot more running at the local level.
Mhm.
I mean, I wouldn't say a lot, and certainly not enough that are reflecting our actual size of secular non-religious Americans. And you know, at the national level, we do have the Free Thought Caucus now, which is great. But only one member of Congress identifies as religiously unaffiliated. The term atheist is still a term that it's a lot, especially at the national and maybe even state level to some extent, though a little less so, is a term that a lot of people don't want to use. And I mean, like in general, that's a very complicated word, and I've done a lot of research on that word atheist, and I know it's a contentious term in our community in some ways. But yeah, I mean, I think it's getting better, but it still isn't, of course, where I would love it to be, but I think it's going to take time, and I'm excited about the improvements I've seen. I'm hoping it continues to get better.
Christina, this is Jerry. Could you talk a little bit more about the National Day of Prayer and how it is the product of really a conspiracy by the family? Some of you may have seen a documentary on that, headed by George Coe, who had an extremely powerful influence on the merging of religion and government in such examples as the National Day of Prayer.
Yeah, so I haven't had the chance to really dig into that yet, although it's on my list of many things to look into. But yeah, I think the family is a organization that they're responsible for the National Prayer Breakfast. They were also very influential in getting the National Day of Prayers, which we've had National Day of Prayers throughout U.S. history, but in 1952 is when it was petitioned to make it an annual event. The president has to declare one now by federal law. So that makes it even more challenging for a non-theist to become president if they now have to declare a National Day of Prayer that they don't actually believe in. It seems kind of difficult. But I think that really, even though I can't speak too specifically on the family, I'd love to learn more about them and do more research. That's a good documentary. I actually met someone who was briefly a part of the family and was like, that documentary seems super kind of conspiracy theory-esque. It's very accurate. So according to this ex-member. But the 1950s, you just have so much kind of push for theist normativity, not just by the US government, which is what I'm focusing on right now, but through Hollywood. There was the Ten Commandments movie and the posting of Ten Commandment statues all around the United States. There was a documentary that was about the history of the seal and our religious foundation that was kind of spread and considered kind of a big reason. People's positive response to that was argued as a good reason to make "In God We Trust" the national motto. So you just have a lot of different things going on from all places, from schools promoting more prayer, government doing legislation, Hollywood sharing these narratives. So it just came from all sides to tell the American people, you need to see yourself as theistic. And then Christian nationalists could really use that to push their agenda even further, of which the family in particular did.
Christina, this is Tom. The people have requested like a way to contact you for more information. Is that something that you'd be willing to put in the chat?
I'm putting in my email right now.
Okay. All right. That'll make it easier.
I see someone found my master's thesis. So that's on Eisenhower's rhetoric. So I've kind of broke it down and looking at how Eisenhower talked about the American people as theistic in his inaugural address. And that kind of really emphasis. But then also in my other main chapter of my thesis, I talk about how he talked about atheism and how he mostly equated it with communism, but also he just talked about atheists sometimes generally, and he did not say nice things. So it was very much this kind of anti-atheism and how that was so normalized. So that if you want to read that, someone posted it in the chat I saw.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, this is working out better when people want to ask questions, because I guess we have just not too many. So it works out to do it by just chiming in when you have a question. We'll go ahead and just continue that. This is great. Keep on going. We still have plenty of time. So keep going. Any more questions?
Yeah, Christina, can you hear me? This is Peter Ruman.
I can. Hi.
Hi. I gave up all religions when I was a early teen, and have been anti-religion or no religion since that time period. And so you'll have to forgive me for asking this because I don't understand a lot of the terminology. For example, God, I don't understand. Can you, if I say, or if I interpret the word "in God we trust," can I replace that with in anything, whatever we trust? I just don't understand that terminology in that use, and what evangelicals and other people think about that. Can you explain?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's part of actually why the motto is so successful, is because it's argued that God can mean anything to anybody. So because the term God is so broad and has almost lost a explicitly Christian meaning, it's not explicitly Christian. So that is actually a really common argument that is used to justify keeping it. And actually, that's one reason why actually a lot of Christians oppose the national motto "and under God," is they feel like it's cheapening what they view in God. And so that's, I think, a really good point there. Again, I think if you look at the founding documents, a lot of the people were interpreting God as just specifically the God of the Christian Bible. And that was just this specific idea of a higher power looking down on us, who is a really common narrative, particularly in early U.S. history, but continues today, is the idea that the United States is God's chosen nation. So we've been specially selected by God to spread His word around the world and to help succeed His mission. And we need to set an example for the entire world based on biblical views. So I think that might connect to it. But yeah, it's just one of those terms that can be so broad or so specific depending on how you want to use it. And unfortunately, Christian nationalists in particular can use it in a way that's, both protects them from being accused of violating the First Amendment, but also it can be used to advance their agenda. So.
Okay, great, thanks. One other thing that's bothersome to me, and that is I've spent, ever since discarding religion, I have attempted to find purpose, and have used science entirely to define that. And where it becomes very difficult, but not impossible, is to define how you derive your morality from science. And that becomes a typical question, I think, for religious people of atheists. And I'm not sure if anybody else in the audience wants to respond to that or not.
I think this is one of those questions that we could go down a full-blown rabbit hole with this, of the whole, what is morality? So I'll just give you kind of my perspective. For me, because I get this question all the time, is if you're an atheist, what's stops you from going out and murdering people? And you're just like, if if your religion stops from doing that, you keep being religious. But for me, I kind of think of the idea of, if I think this is the only life that we get, and I think that, if someone is in trouble and I'm the only one who can help them, I want to do what I can. And my general philosophy is I want to do as little harm as I can in the world. And that sometimes, and you can never do no harm. Sometimes you have to make choices between, your own mental health and somebody else's mental health. So, me saying I'm an atheist might upset somebody else, but I've ultimately decided that it does more good for me to say it than to make someone else feel comfortable. And I think a lot of that comes from my humanism. So I think that everyone get the morality from a different place. I think, part of it comes from our own personal personalities. I think it also can come from, the laws of the society we live in. For some people, it's religion, if that's where it is. I don't think anyone gets their morality purely from religion. I think it's usually a combination. And I think we see that through the fact that morals have vastly changed, from, 1800s when slavery was considered moral. And today we're, for the most part, like, no, let's not do that. So, I mean, to me, it's just more society and, this idea that there's some way to
I
get
have some trouble with the word humanist in that it does not bring in the rest of Gaia and life in general. And that needs to be a moral issue from my standpoint. But anyway,
Yeah.
I'll digress.
And I think that's fair. I think, language is so tricky. And that's one of the reasons why I study language, is because, particularly amongst our community, we do have this large debate about, do we call ourselves humanists, secularists, atheists, non-religious? And this has been a long-standing debate amongst our community. And I think it also kind of somewhat gets to the fact that we are really aware of the implications of our language, and we want to find the perfect word, and there probably isn't one. And we just have to keep having that discussion and at least try to understand what people come from. And, I choose to use the word atheist for political reasons because I want to challenge the stereotype, but I fully understand why someone else might not want to, those types of things. So.
Peter, let me follow up and just say that humanism addressed morality considerably. There are many good books on the subject. If you go to the website of the American Humanist Association, you will find many articles. And Humanism at the Hub, at the Secular Hub in Denver, has made several presentations on how the source of morality that is non-religious, that humanism has adopted. And I don't think science is considered to be, well, in my opening humanist moment, I mentioned how important science is to humanists and atheists, but isn't necessarily the source of our humanism, the source of our morality. So I think there are a number of sources that you could read about that. I just wanted to comment on that, but if I might impose further, I have another question for Katrina. In talking about the "In God We Trust" on money, cash and coins and so forth, I had the thought that while the objection to that by many secularists is that even in that subtle or not so subtle way, it spreads the concept. And that's just one more way that maybe Christian extremists or Christian nationalists, Christian dominionists, want to make America a theocracy, excuse me. But I'm wondering if you think there has been any impact or could be any impact on the fact that the use of money is declining. Very few people, or a lot fewer people, use cash and coins anymore for financial transactions with credit cards and bank transfers. And there are many ways that are now more dominant in the way we use financial transactions than money. Do you think there's any chance that that change might actually undermine "In God We Trust" on money?
Well, I think that's actually a really good point I hadn't thought about, but that's actually probably part of the reason why Project Blitz are such huge advocates of putting "In God We Trust" on other things, putting it on public buildings, putting it on police cars, which is in itself a little bit scary. This idea of we need to have this motto in as many places as possible, and if we don't have as much cash being used, particularly thinking about younger people, because that is a group that tends to be more secular, and it's a group that Christian nationalists tend to try to target more, particularly through their use of the schools. That is actually probably a potential influencer. I mean, I don't know for sure if it is, but I can definitely imagine it being a factor. So again, we need to fight these bills so that doesn't happen, so that hopefully maybe it will kind of decrease the use of it and whatnot.
Thank you.
I want to add real quick, I saw that somebody asked me to share Project Blitz's playbook, and so I just shared the link for that in the chat for their 2018-2019 playbook. It's 150 pages, it's intense, and it's kind of stressful to read, but it's a good one to look at because they're very explicit about kind of why they're doing different legislation, and they give a lot of tools for legislators to try to get these things passed. So if you want to look at that.
Jerry, I appreciate your comments, but I would puzzle over. I cannot see how the term "In God We Trust" on a bill will change the behavior of criminals and other people who use money in that fashion. And the second thing I want to say is that I have read some of the humanist literature, but not all of it. You probably have read much more of it than I have. But what puzzles me is if the stability of life on Earth is primarily based on the smallest organisms, bacteria and viruses, do you find that and your morality in humanity, in your humanism? I do not. I do not find how you can possibly find that in humanism.
I think this definitely seems like a very important discussion that we can have a whole nother lecture and discussion on this for sure. I do want to point out, I think what you just said about the idea that money won't necessarily convert someone or stop someone from committing a crime. I think that's a good point. I don't necessarily think that anyone is really necessarily thinking that, seeing "In God We Trust" is going to convert people. But I think there is something to say about kind of normative structures, whether it's heteronormativity, or whatever it is, part of the issue is that we're very much trained to have like kind of what is common sense. So for a lot of people, it's common sense that belief in God makes us more moral, or it's common sense that America is a religious nation. And that's just what we've been told over and over and over again. So then when there's someone who doesn't fit into that mold, it makes us think that they're deviant. And so I think it's more about reinforcing this common sense narrative that really pushes a religious nationalist agenda versus actually converting people. It's just like, it's more of a silencing method in a lot of ways, because it makes it more dangerous for people to speak up because they're challenging a norm, which can be difficult to do.
I'd like to respond to Andrea's comment about the Biden, saying the prayers or whatever and appealing to Jesus and having a priest. That's kind of typical of what politicians do. And I think that Biden does respect the separation of church and state. I don't really know exactly what his stance is on that. I don't like the idea that they're religious, or what they're trying to appeal to the religious majority. That is unfortunate, but you have to. I mean, I'm overlooking that. I'm going to vote for Biden, and everyone should, because if we don't, Trump's going to get reelected, and that's going to be like 100 times, 1,000 times worse. So we need to have Biden in there. Just got to do it. Otherwise we're in big trouble.
Just
Maybe
kind
I
of
shouldn't get too political, though.
Just kind of on that note, going back to the whole use of Biden's use of religion, I dropped a book title in that people might be interested in reading. If it's just this book talks about the ways that since the 1980s, presidents have massively increased their use of very explicit God talk and explicit, and also their use of Christianity in their rhetoric, which you wouldn't necessarily expect because we're more secular than we ever were, but yet presidents in particular tend to use religion more now than at any other time in history. And so that's a really good book to kind of parses through why that might be and how it comes out. And it's another pretty good one to kind of get to some of that issues.
Again, I think from what I've read of the polls, if I was a politician, I would be forced into that direction, even though I'm an atheist. My biggest question is, how do you change the entire American public? You can't do it with this nitty-gritty stuff.
I actually disagree. I think you can with the kind of the nitty gritty. I think it's very similar, again, similar to, imagine 100 years ago, if we talk about heteronormativity, I mean, people probably could never imagine that we would allow same-sex marriage, but a lot of it came from trying to normalize same-sex relationships and I think and trying to attack those kind of common assumptions. And I think that it's certainly not going to change things overnight, and we need to obviously do we need to attack the issue from a lot of different angles. But I think that we shouldn't take for granted the way that these kind of normative narratives can be very powerful tools for maintaining oppression and silencing groups and making people too afraid to join the cause because they don't want to out themselves. So, it's one of the many things that we can do.
Yeah, but I mean, I can look historically at my own family, and back in the 1800s, my great-great-grandfather was a Lutheran minister. My grandfather was a Methodist minister. My father was a Mason, and I think the early century was really focused on Christianity, and the core question in my mind is, if you're going to change that, you really have to change religion in general. And I don't see how you can promote atheism to change religion. I really think you have to get into the religions as an atheist and start saying, I don't get it. I don't understand that word. Where are you going with that? That doesn't make sense to me. Those kind of things.
I think it actually depends on what your goal is, and I think that's something actually I should clarify here. So I think it depends on if your goal is to kind of try to stop Christianity more broadly, then I think that's a fair point. For me, I think what I'm more advocating for is, if we want to live in a society that really respects freedom of religion and says, if in a society that has, the First Amendment, hopefully try to appeal to people to want to uphold that and respect the fact that an atheist can also exist in the United States. The United States, and you shouldn't pass a law that's based off of Christian ideals that affects all people. So I think part of that just depends on what your goals are. Because if your goal is to kind of completely get rid of Christianity, then maybe challenging theist-normativity isn't the best way. But if your goal is to try to make it the United States stand up to its ideals of freedom of religion, I think it's a good thing to focus on.
Any other questions at all? Well, here's my comment about it. This is where I'm going to end up. Where all of us are going to end up. But I think it'll be more fun than going to heaven, even with the flames around. So
we'll all be there with you.
And this was a really hot topic too.
That's great, Tom.
Thank you.
So, unless anybody has any more.